Hello, everyone. Professor Barry here. Today, this installment of Soc 201 video lecture is on sociological theory and the sociological imagination. Kind of the goal and the objective of this lecture is just to provide you a little bit of background on kind of sociological imagination. C. Wright Mills, his idea about what the sociological imagination is. We'll kind of be working with it throughout the course of the term, so it's kind of a good kind of framework. And then we'll dive into theory. Theories are just perspectives that are grounded in research, grounded in kind of rational thought, grounded in critical thinking. Theories are, applied to research, gather information to either support aspects of a theory or to critique aspects of a theory. We have three main theories in sociology: structural functionalism, AKA functionalism; symbolic interactionism, AKA also known as interactionism; and then finally conflict theory, also known as Marxism. European countries just call it what it is, and that's a Marxist perspective. We call it conflict theory, in part, I think, because of our cultural history of kind of Marxism has this sort of viewpoint, or it has a meaning in American culture differently than it does in other countries around the world, right? So anyway, conflict theory, Marxism, same thing. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. So this first slide you see here, basically lab-grown insect meat. Yeah, protein. I mean, like, why not? Lab-grown meat. Maybe this will be a wave of the future. Of course, big changes going on in sort of the vegan food industry. Eating plant-based foods, more and more products that are plant-based products. Culture is shifting. And now we sort of more and more focus on things like crickets and cricket as a protein source. Cricket flour, you can actually buy cricket flour to make bread, other kind of items like that. Yeah, so thinking about the food that we eat, right? There's a little bit of there's a sociological journey you could take with food. Why do we eat certain kinds of food? Why not other kinds of food? How is culture tied to what we produce, as well as what we consume in terms of food? You can just sort of go on and on there. And then we'll kind of get to this other thing about looking at Oregon and looking at why is Oregon so white. And I like this sort of example is that we live in a particular location, in this case, thinking about geographic location. There's sometimes a lot of influences that go back historically that could be tied into government policy, could be tied into cultural values and conditions that shape something so tangible as the racial demographics of a community. And one of the reasons why Oregon is white, there's a reason for that. There's a few reasons, main reasons, but some of that you have to kind of go back into history to understand the present. And that's a little bit about sociological imagination, kind of takes you there as well. So let's kind of define it, right? Okay, sociological imagination, C. Wright Mills, Columbia University, 1950s, a sociologist who came up with this idea or promoted this idea about the sociological imagination. Put it in a context too, 1950s is a time period of relative stability. It's actually economic growth for most everyone. It's a time of kind of social equalizing. More social groups, including people of color, African Americans, are gaining in terms of economic income is developing, employment developing. It's a time period of greater access to the American dream in the 1950s, development of suburbia. Underneath that, there's a lot of other things that are going on. And what was going on in the 1950s, it became the age of complacency in a lot of ways. Post-World War II, I think probably facilitated this as well, is rather than digging in and trying to understand some of the social issues that were going on after World War II, there was sort of a cultural shift to complacency. If you ever seen, complacency, not engaging in sort of those broader kind of social issues that may be going on within communities. And so that's where the context around where the sociological imagination that Mills kind of puts together says, basically trying to call our attention to be able to dig in a little bit deeper and to understand things that are going on, not only in contemporary social life, but the connection between contemporary world and the past. So a couple different ideas that I kind of extracted from the sociological imagination I think are kind of cornerstones for it. One is this idea that a personal biography, so an individual's self, their history, is connected to history itself. So, I mean, and then it's like, okay, well, that's obvious, right? Let's kind of scratch on that a little bit, or kind of like identify, well, why is that important, or where does that take us? So I looking at myself as a, let's say, as a gendered self, an individual with a particular sexual orientation. Those are my ideas in terms of gender are a byproduct of culture, history, social groups that I belong to, connections that I've made. A lot of influences that are going on in culture from the macro level all the way down to the micro level. So to understand, I would, what Mill's kind of advocating, where perspective I'm providing here, is that to understand oneself and one's own journey in life requires understanding history, right? And the more you become aware of history, the more you can see yourself in a sort of a different perspective, a more objective perspective, a perspective more rooted in kind of realities. So that's kind of one component. So calling our attention to recognizing sort of that connection between self and context. And then the second part is distinguish between private troubles and public issues. So the example that C. Wright Mills uses, and I'm going to get the numbers right, but he says, okay, imagine there's 10,000 people who are unemployed. Those are private troubles. Or you could say one person unemployed, it's a private trouble. It's a trouble to the individual, right? So it's an individual level trouble. But if we had 1 million people unemployed, it's a larger public issue. So it's no longer about the individual, it's about the pattern. Why does the pattern exist? What's going on that's related to larger issues versus the individual? And this becomes really powerful, right? So we start thinking about things like poverty, rather than blaming poverty on individual causes. So rather than saying, well, people just aren't working hard enough, or people are not doing the things they need to move themselves forward in this economy, we start to look at poverty is a public issue. Poverty is linked up to access to education, family upbringing, context around the family, where a family is situated, access to resources and institutions to be able to engage in this particular economy. So there's a lot of different things that are going on that are shaping that are way outside of the individual. It's a public issue. And another reason that's important is the public issue. If we focus on there, that's where we focus our attention in trying to create reform or trying to create changes. So if we're trying to deal with poverty, it doesn't work from a larger societal level. Blaming the individual doesn't help us to deal with the underlying structural conditions in which poverty comes from. So we have to get to the public issue in order to address that particular social issue. So that's that last component, right? So it gets us to that structural kind of condition kind of thing. A couple other points about the sociological imagination. If we see the social forces, we also humanize ourselves and we humanize others. So if I understand the history of immigration in the United States, issues of immigration in general, if I understand in specifically history of immigration and immigration policy going back to the 1800s, where we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first act where a particular racial group was excluded from immigrating to the United States. If I understand going back to the 1800s all the way through to the present, I can better understand some of the rhetoric that happens in mass society among politicians and others. I can better understand the objective reality versus this sort of emotional kind of thing that goes on about immigration. That's not a valid or an objective representation of reality. So the more I understand history, or the more a person reads history, the more we humanize versus dehumanize. I think it automatically takes you there to that space. So I use the example like white privilege. Okay, I have white privilege. I have throughout my life. I will continue to have white privilege in my life. That doesn't take away from my own accomplishments, what I've done with my life, different choices I've made, but it puts it in context. It humanizes me, but also humanizes other people. And I can start to see that not everybody had the same experiences that I did, right? So it prevents me from unduly judging others without understanding. So another second bullet point there, facilitates understanding of how my skin color provided me a different set of experiences than someone else. Puts myself in check against irrational judgments against other people. Humanizing, humanizing self and others. And I would say it's also about empowering. Once I recognize, a person recognizes the ways, if I recognize the way white privilege operates in my life, I'm more empowered to enter the social world from a place of being informed, being more aware, being less judging towards others, and also more self-empowered regarding that. You can look at this if you want. I mean, I'm not going to go to share it right now, but it's sort of a short video. You can open up the PowerPoint and go to it. It's a really interesting short video. You can probably type it in as well, as far as the title there. Just about Central Oregon, right? Interesting place, the mill, dynamic mill in Central Oregon, down at the old mill. There's the old mill district then and today. A lot of stories, right? What was life like back then? Manufacturing, sort of working in the industry, how that industry develop, what's the history of that kind of industry, where is it at today? So if we kind of go back in time and follow that story, can better understand Central Oregon from the days of westward expansion. And if we go back even further to think about Indigenous people in the community and hearing their stories as well, all of that helps us to better understand the present. So this gets me to this next slide, thinking about, well, why is Oregon so white? And part of that has to do with race-based policies, policies that basically made it difficult or forbid Black people from residing in the state of Oregon. And these were the exclusionary laws. 1844, Oregon Territory started passing exclusionary laws, basically prohibiting Black people from living in the territory for over 3 years. So not establishing long-term residence. But you got to be thinking, if there was a rule and regulation in like no more than 3 years, there's going to be a lot of also stuff going on that makes it's a marginalized group, a group that probably is not going to be very safe and definitely not welcome in the Oregon Territory overall. So there's a long history, right? To understand the present, got to go back, understand the past. But these are kind of some interesting different things to think about using our sociological imagination, a little bit to wonder, to ask questions, to investigate, to look for patterns of behavior, these kind of things. One of them that I find interesting is 96% of dental hygienists are female. It just begs the question, like, why, what's going on in terms of, that rate, gender socialization has to be part of that discussion. Culture and how we view particular occupations has to be part of that as well. Ideas of masculinity in society, probably part of that as well. I'd be kind of curious of how that rate changes across nations. And these are great jobs. To be a dental hygienist, professional, well-paid jobs. And my guess, eventually males will enter that field. Like with nursing, used to be all females. Used to be, of course, all males providing medical services, and then creating sort of a nursing structure in medical communities. And then women became kind of the main provider of nursing. And now it's it's less gender segregated, although there's still more females than males in that occupation. But that's shifted a lot over the last 30 years. Number of women CEOs, Fortune 500 companies. I mean, year 2016, 12 female CEOs, female CEOs of color, even smaller. So what's going on there? Like, right, what are the social forces that are going on? Not the private individual. We're not looking at the individual. We're looking at what's shaping that influence, what's shaping that pattern. Okay, so a couple different concepts I think are kind of add to that discussion a little bit and kind of can, help bring the idea of sociology forward, the sociological imagination. And that's these ideas of the general and the particular, and the strange and the familiar. The general and the particular is looking at patterns. basically looking at patterns, looking at trends across time, across, across place or location. It's basically looking for patterns, right? The strange and the familiar is taking the common every day and finding the uniqueness about it. The uniqueness maybe culturally, the food we eat, right? Like it's so familiar to us that we don't ask the question of what's unique about sort of the food that we eat or how we eat and how we consume. So it's making everyday life, asking questions about it to make it unique, right? To understand the influence of history and culture on it. So let me give you different examples of both of those. Okay, here's the general and the particular. Looking for patterns. Where do you find the most craft breweries? There's a pattern there, right? Where you kind of see this. Okay, well, why does the pattern exist? So if we establish patterns and identify them, it leads us to the next question of, well, where do those patterns come from? How long have they been there? What are the things that influence that pattern? This one here is looking at number of drug overdoses, deaths by drug overdose, 2017. And looking at by region or state by state. You could go county by county. You can see a pattern. You can go to one of these particular places, Tennessee. You go county by county data. My guess is going to be the more impoverished the community, the higher rates of death by overdose are going to be per capita in those particular areas. But patterns help us to, one, get that sociological imagination, right? We'll get to the public issue part, but also understand the broader pattern, not the individual, right? So individuals are always part of the pattern, but patterns help focus our attention on kind of those, like what's shaping the pattern, what cultural, social forces are shaping the pattern. Strange and the familiar, everyday life stuff, right? Making it kind of like looking at it from a different lens, try to understand its uniqueness. This is an advertisement, 1950s, 60s, where doctors were actually promoting smoking particular brands. Kind of strange, right? We can see the strangeness when we look back in time because we have more objectivity, right? You got to be thinking when this advertisement was there in people's environment, people didn't see it as being strange. That was just a normal part of everyday life, right? So I think one of the things about strange and familiar that's difficult sometimes is where we're immersed in culture, we swim in culture, but we don't see that we're actually swimming in it. And so by focusing on the strange and the familiar, we're making things, bringing it to our attention, right? Becoming more aware. And that, I think, leads to being more informed, being more empowered because we're more informed. Anyway, so a couple different examples. This is 1970s, right? Blow in her face and she'll follow you anywhere. So interesting, right? Like that would not be an advertisement of success. For today, 40, 50 years later, ideas of gender have changed, all kinds of different things, right? But anyway, so again, when we have historical distance, we can look back and see that. Joe Camel, 1980s, 1990s, a lot of critique over Joe Camel. Lawsuit filed where that Joe Camel was promoting products towards youth and kids using these sort of the cool Joe Camel character. And there's a lot of history, with the tobacco industry peddling their products or advertising products towards youth and kids. During that time period when there was that controversy, it was hard for people to see it because they're caught in the moment. But the more historical distance you have, easier it is to see it. A couple of other examples. This is when I was in San Francisco a couple of years ago. This is pretty common in a lot of cities, right? You see a structure like this. This is basically to prevent individuals from sitting and on these places within the public. I mean, designed to be less friendly towards people who are homeless. That's the idea. Organic milk. The reason this is a good example for me. I was years ago going through Costco, pulled this gallon of milk out, and I looked at that and I thought, there is no way I can make that big. So it's interesting how we market food, right? There's no cows on this carton of milk. It's this pastoral kind of nice setting, right? Very green, a couple little chickens out there. I can guarantee you, I don't think that milk is coming from that farm, right? So I think part of the strange and the familiar too is asking questions about stuff, what we see in terms of our visual landscape in this regard. I mean, it leads you to all kinds of different thoughts, ideas. Years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I Love Booby campaign. I was just like, this is interesting kind of thing to look at sociologically. It's objectification, even though it's bringing awareness about breast cancer to the public, it's still objectifying women. It's not I love breasts, right? Or I care for, or I want, healthy breasts, hashtag healthy breast or something. It's I love boobies. Testicular cancer exists. I love balls would probably not be something that would be a bracelet. Although they do sell bracelets that say I love balls, but is it really about promoting awareness, or is it about something else going on in terms of that? Anyway, so it's just sort of another example. This cup here, if this was another country, we'd have to tell you that this coffee may be hot. Good thing this is Canada. Culture, right? Culture, like what do we see things in terms of culture? All right, sociological theories. Let's kind of go down that pathway. So that the first part kind of laid a framework, sociological imagination, general and particular, strange and the familiar. Now we kind of get into theories a little bit. A couple different quotes to kind of get at some different ideas. You have W. Du Bois here, first African-American to graduate as a sociologist from Harvard University. And it's trying to draw that we need to become aware, right? That's the only way to bring about change, to facilitate greater democratic principles, equality of opportunity, freedoms and protections, is that we have to become more engaged and informed. Harriet Martineau, very strong sociological perspective that she advanced, that really provided a lot of framework in thinking about patriarchy, thinking about kind of some conflict theory issues in terms of power and dynamics in society itself. Max Weber, he's our sociologist that we go to when we think about bureaucracies, the development of bureaucracies, the rational society, that he becomes sort of a founding figure in terms of a lot of theories coming out of that. Durkheim is our functionalist theorist, and then Karl Marx is our conflict theorist. Okay, so 3 different theories, 3 different perspectives. You can think about them as lenses, and each of them have a long history. When I was in my PhD program, taking a class in sociological theory, you're reading, massive books about these theories. And my goal here is to bring the major ideas forward of what these theories are and how we can use them to understand the social world. If you ever have any questions, let me know, in class, or drop me an email. The functionalist perspective, one model to keep in mind, think about ecosystem. Think about the environment as an ecosystem. The social environment is an ecosystem. A lot of different parts that each have a function. Different parts meaning criminal justice, education, healthcare, the economy, government. All these different institutions have a function to help try to create stability within the social world. I think one way of thinking about functionalism I think can be really helpful is to think about society as a problem-solving entity, okay? COVID has kind of demonstrated this. You could look at it from a functionalist lens, right? So major social issue happens that threatens the life and security of the nation. So not only at the individual loss of life, but our economy, our way of life, our ability to be competitive in sort of the global world. It's a threat to society itself. So we develop institutions or ways of working within institutions to help bring about advances in science, availability of vaccines, ways to take care of the health of people within the community itself. So this becomes maybe sort of a functionalist kind of way of thinking about COVID. Interdependent parts, right? So kids aren't going to school. Man, what's the impact in terms of family when kids aren't going to school? What's the impact in terms of family? What about impact on families, impact on budget, impact on a lot of different areas of social life. So you can kind of go down that list, but it's basically looking at interrelated parts. Society is a problem-solving entity, and it's trying to create this stable social order. On the other end, we sort of see a macro level theory, a conflict theory of looking at issues of inequality and trying to understand them to promote a more equitable society itself. The Marxist perspective actually has probably one of the most optimistic viewpoints of humans. A Marxist view is that humans are inherently good. It's the structure in society that corrupts, not the individual. So there's an orientation around Marxism. It's often forgotten that Marxist perspective has a very optimistic view of humans. But to allow humans to be more human and humanizing towards each other, we have to be able to challenge the systems that we have to become more focused on actualizing more of our democratic principles, equality of opportunity, due process, constitutional rights, making sure everyone has is supported by constitutional rights, that there's not inequalities that are going on with those at those particular levels. And then the micro level theory is symbolic interactionism. And I use a sort of example here. I was in this drugstore waiting in line one day, looked over and saw all the different language for lip gloss or lipstick. It's like, wow, interesting. Interactionism, study of language and culture, language, culture, self-concept, identities. These are the things that would be looked at from an interactionist viewpoint. Yeah, I mean, all the language, right? Very telling about gender and sexuality, kind of the intersection between those. So that's kind of part of that piece. I won't show this in this video here, but I encourage you if you want. This is from the Khan Academy, I believe. A great, real quick summary of the three theories. Or four theories, I guess we're putting constructionism and symbolic interactionism. Those are, constructionism kind of goes underneath the umbrella of interactionism, kind of. But anyway, it's a good way to sort of get introduced to the theories that way. Okay, so functionalism, I'll kind of just describe it maybe a little bit more. Okay, that idea of society is a biological organism, trying to solve problems, everything's interdependent. The idea is that society is built upon a value consensus. We elect people to represent us at the state level, at the federal level. The policies that we have in our local community, our state or national or our federal level have to do with this sort of idea about a value consensus. The functionalist perspective has this viewpoint that if there's something existing in society, it has to serve a need or a function. If something exists in societies and exists across time and place, it has to have a function. There's a reason for it. And it's there in part because there's an agreement among members of society of the value and the benefit of that. So it's based on this sort of idea that there's a value consensus. And there's a limit to this theory we'll get to in a minute, but I'll kind of leave it at that for the moment. Then there's this idea of which is a real key part of functionalism, that we have to understand the degree to which people are integrated within communities and society, that Durkheim focused on. We won't go into the details of it, but about suicide. If people are under-integrated or over-integrated, there'd be different likelihoods of suicide regarding that. So it's important that we feel belonging, have a sense of connection to groups and to community, that we have integration into society itself, into our nation, and that we embrace sort of common core values, right? It's not full agreement, but common core values. So for example, the Pledge of Allegiance, right? We get integrated into that idea about the Pledge of Allegiance. We get socialized into reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, the values that are embodied in the Pledge of Allegiance. The functionalist viewpoint is we establish that in order to create this sort of value consensus and stability, or it's a reflection of value consensus. And the goal is to create some of the social glue that binds us together in terms of groups and society itself. And then there's the issue of regulation. All societies and communities and groups have ways of regulating, whether informally, stigma, responding to others in terms of positive feedback or negative feedback, or all the way to kind of regulation in a more formal way, thinking about laws, institutional regulations, and regulation is an important part of creating a stable social order, right? So if there was no regulation, if there was under-regulation, it creates a problem, or if there's over-regulation where people are too controlled, that doesn't allow for enough human autonomy, it creates problems in them, as well. Anomie is normlessness. And when society is changing and it changes fairly rapidly, it creates anomie, a state of normlessness. COVID, right? I mean, from March 2020 to where we're at today, a lot of sudden change, very disruptive, very challenging, created a lot of disorder. The idea is from a functionalist viewpoint, eventually is to get back to that place of order and stability itself. Social dysfunctions happen. It's a natural part of every system. There's dysfunctions, and the idea is that dysfunctions inform us about where there may be kind of problems in the system and places to go to make correction. The view of social change is that it's gradual, slow reform working within the system itself. Martin Luther King is a great example in some ways of this sort of functionalist sort of idea. His "I Have a Dream" speech really captures the ideas of the sort of reformatory nature of social change. The democratic principles of what we say we stand for, he's asking that we put those to practice, that we all should be able to sit at this table of brotherhood. Doesn't matter who we are in terms of our religious background or our racial background, but we're sharing in this project together. And he's urging America to actualize its promise. Martin Luther King also had a more conflict theory side too, but we could kind of get into that, but that's kind of the example of functionalism. A couple different examples thinking about suicide rate, much higher among people who are divorced versus single, widowed, or married. That's that integration. I mean, the Durkheim's perspective is still applied in research today, looking at groups who are more integrated into society tend to be less likely to commit suicide. And then we can kind of look at suicide by different racial groups and look at we have a pattern, right? The general and the particular, using our sociological imagination. So we have to kind of get to that space. We sort of ask questions, well, why is it that way? What's going on in terms of how do we explain this distribution? Functionalist perspective, different examples. Gangs are a functional response to a dysfunction in the environment. Gangs serve an important social need, belonging, connection, status within a community. So gangs are actually a functional adaptation to a dysfunction within the environment itself. Sports, man, a lot of functions of sports, right? Sports provide a vehicle for people to do a lot of learning of certain values, certain behaviors, certain ways of engaging in healthy competition. I mean, all the different kind of stuff can be really important. Centers of disease control, an institution has a vital function to play in trying to create a stable social order. Black Lives Matter, I think, is a representation. There's, the value consensus shifted, right? So when there was incidences where individuals lost their life or died in the hands of law enforcement, George Floyd was kind of straw that broke the camel's back, and you kind of go back to where Black Lives Matter, kind of the origins of Black Lives Matter, go back to earlier events. I want to say it was in Ferguson, Michael Brown. I believe that's the case where Black Lives Matter came from. It was after that particular event. Mobilizing, right? This is how social change happens. The value, the way in which we viewed this particular issue in terms of police brutality shifted as a nation. And people started asking different questions, mobilizing, demanding some change. So value, consensus, changing, shifting, based on people within community saying, hey, look, there's a dysfunction here. We need to do something about it. And we're going to exercise our voice to make that change. This is a symbol here of looking at, the United States is a diverse religions represented in the United States. To be able to figure out how to create a national identity and stability, to create it across division is going to be very problematic. To be able to open up sort of this perspective to see America in terms of our diversity and celebrate, recognize, and support that diversity is a place from a functionalist viewpoint of much more stability and much more greater strength with that. Conflict theory gets into this idea of historical materialism. Materialism is the economic structure. Capitalism is a economic structure. If you go back about 10,000 years ago, we developed the first agricultural-based societies. It happened in kind of the Fertile Crescent in Africa. Cities were developing for the first time in that area of the world. And that's new economic structure, agrarian type of society. So think about materialism as a type of society. And that's where, Marxist perspective looks at the historical development of different types of society and looks at that the issues that are experienced in society go back to the economic conditions. So this is why Marx is very critical of capitalism, because capitalism creates the haves and the have-nots. Capitalism creates the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, those who own the means of production, versus the proletariat, the workers. So in that model, there's already a development of kind of unequal distribution of power and resources. And there's a value coercion going on, that those with the power and resources are coercing others into certain values and ideals and laws and different kind of things like that. If you go back to, a Constitution and go through different aspects of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, and you look at the 14th Amendment, which was protection for helping to ensure that equality of opportunity, equality of experience, and also that individuals had due process. It came out, the 14th Amendment, out of a struggle after emancipation, where freed slaves were, for a period of time during Reconstruction, were moving into leadership positions within government, state level, federal level. After the federal troops were removed from the South, we started to see kind of like vigilante justice in the South, strong kind of white backlash, white supremacy, really advancing itself in the South. And the 14th Amendment was put into place in a way to help ensure and protect the rights of those individuals who were freed slaves. But the story of the 14th Amendment, as well as other amendments, is that did it really do the job that it said it was going to do? And was it ever really the intent to do the job that it said it was going to do as well? So sometimes, the conflict theory, the Marxist viewpoint is that, power is going to try to protect itself. And it may try to pacify and appease different groups. And it can do that. And when it tries to pacify different groups, it helps to create false consciousness, right? People think something's being done, for example, or they're not aware of why certain conditions exist the way they do, or they misplace kind of the origins of why certain things are going on. And Marx's idea was that people have to develop class consciousness. They have to become aware of the roots of the problems themselves. So it's much more of a model of social justice, race, class, gender, sexual orientation. It's a model based on understanding power, privilege, and domination, and it's moving towards much more of a social justice perspective. Demanding or requiring or asking for or mobilizing for radical restructure of society itself. So not reforming within the institution, but radically restructure it. United States is one of the few countries, a few industrialized countries, does not have a universal healthcare system. We could try to reform within the institution of our current healthcare delivery system. That's a functionalist viewpoint. Conflict theory critique of that would be, well, if you're working within the institution, the current institutions, that the insurance companies, the medical establishment are going to figure out the way to generate the most profit for themselves in that particular component. So profit over necessarily the health and well-being of people within the community itself. So a radical restructure would be the generation of universal healthcare that's government run, supported, but not through the private sector. That'd be a major shift for the way that we operate, right? Let's kind of focus on a different model. Couple of different examples, the average CEO versus the average worker, changes across time, but really started in the 1980s, 1990s. We saw the explosion of that average CEO, average worker. How do you justify that, right? It's a lot of income and a lot of power eventually into the hands of few people. And how does that shape policy? How does that shape our communities? Meanwhile, workers are struggling. So how do we justify that, right? Oprah vindicated. So Oprah back in maybe the 1980s, during her talk show one time, she made a comment that she's no longer going to eat beef. And there must have been an E. coli breakout at that time or something. And she said that, and she got sued for food libel by the cattle industry or the beef industry. Went through the court system, and eventually the courts came back and said she was not engaging in, the lawsuit was frivolous, it was unfounded, but food libel is powerful. The food industry has created laws to prevent us becoming more informed and educated about what's going on in certain industries within the food industry. Think about the meat industry. If we were to expose the meat industry, how that might shape consumer behavior. Yeah, for sure, the industry is going to be creating laws and ways of doing things that help protect them. I mean, it's power money, right? This diagram here goes back to the early 1900s, or actually 1800s, the belief that, and I think it was, anyway, the Black Irish on the left, Chinese devouring Uncle Sam, this idea that immigrants are taking jobs. I mean, this idea, right, about that is long rooted in American history and is oftentimes used, this idea of particular groups taking someone's jobs is used to achieve political power or basically get people to vote, and not dealing with the underlying problems that might exist. Okay, just a different example. City council, Seattle's kind of interesting. Seattle's gone to universal paid family leave for certain categories of workers. We are the only industrialized country without paid medical leave for maternity or paternity. Interesting. Like, how do you sort of understand that? Voter suppression laws. I mean, Georgia is probably the most notorious for this, suppressing the vote of particular groups. And it's about political power. I mean, it's about strategizing in ways for a particular party to maintain their position. So it's not about trying to promote democracy. It's about trying to ensure access to power. And this chart here, or this example here, let's see, I can't even read the top of that. Okay, yes, okay, the criminal justice system, looking at this, the criminal justice system, is it really designed to prevent criminal activity? It's response agent, and we need that. But the question is whether or not here from a conflict theory viewpoint, whether or not the system is designed in a way that we're not going after the underlying roots of the problems themselves. It's a way from us to disengage from understanding the larger issues that are causing some of these underlying conditions and problems that are going on within community. Because to do that, we have to deal with dollars. We have to deal with how do we build communities? It's going to take resources. And rather than investing in those resources, investing in those communities, sometimes we take a social control mechanism and apply it instead. There's been a lot of focus on that actually mass incarceration itself, starting in the 1980s and 1990s with the war on drugs, has actually fueled inequality in a lot of communities. So not only was that a response to inequality, but it's actually facilitating additional inequality itself. So those policies are detrimental policies, like the war on drugs and related policies are detrimental because they not only do they not deal with a problem or public treating it as drugs as a public health issue for common use is one model versus criminalization. Criminalization serves other needs. Criminalization is a reinforcement. It reinforces inequality. It comes from inequality itself, and it reinforces it. Look at that kind of issue. It's issue of looking at the cost of prison. I think we need to become more class conscious, more conscious or aware in order to be able to change that system. I think most Americans really aren't aware of kind of policies and aware of the cost of them to individuals, community, and the rest of us in terms of taxpayers. This just begs explanation. We incarcerate more than anyone else in the industrialized world. I mean, it's so. Looking at that general pattern, sociological imagination, in the case of conflict theory, is asking the questions about What's the connection to power and inequality? And then let's kind of go into Weber. Weber gets us, and we'll talk more about this in week 2. Weber gets us into rationalization, modernization. So how we understand the development of modern world has become one that's much more rational, right? So this is pre-modern, modern. So the ways in which we design society is different based on sort of the shift to modernity, science, new technology, more rational social order, development of bureaucracies. There's a whole sort of focus of Weber, Max Weber, on the development of institutions and bureaucracies, rules, regimentation, in order to facilitate the accomplishment of institutional goals. But there's consequences to that as well. What he talked about, the iron cage of rationality, and we'll talk about that again next week. The world is, for Weber, he uses this word of disenchanted. The world becomes increasingly disenchanted. The more that we focus on the sort of rationalization of society, we lose some of the mystical, magical, supernatural kind of ideas about the physical world and the social world, and things become something to be sort of understood through that lens of science and rationality. So the world becomes increasingly disenchanted. I like this sort of concept too of Weber, Verstehen, of empathic understanding, of understanding from another group or another person's viewpoint. So Weber, in addition to these bigger pieces, looking at like rationalization, modernization, looking at the understanding of perspective. And that was kind of a radical sort of viewpoint to sort of be taking when he was doing his theorizing. I use this example of white straight teeth, of trying to get to, and it's very rational, this idea of uniformity, rationality, modernization, new science, technology. It enters our space in different ways. So it's just something to kind of an example there. Symbolic interactionism gets into language and symbols, perceptions, meaning, our self-concept, how we identify ourselves. One way of thinking about interactionism is that our behavior before our response, before we respond to something, there's a stimulus, like something happens, but then it's the interpretation. So how we interpret something influences our response. Marijuana has no particular interpretation, right? So marijuana, stimulus, response in terms of how we think about it or how we respond to it, if we were to see it, or it's part of our culture, it all depends on the interpretation. If we view that marijuana leads to criminal activity, that marijuana causes sexual assault, marijuana causes insanity, I mean, the things that were coming out in the 1920s and 1930s, then it leads us to a certain perspective, right? So the object, the stimulus may not change, but our interpretation may change, and that shapes the response. So the meanings that we have come from social interaction, our groups that we belong to, the social world that we belong to. Nothing has any inherent meaning, but it's meaning that we give things based on context. This is an example in terms of sports mascots. Cleveland Indians, and they're going to change their mascot as well. Washington Redskins has now removed the Redskins from, they're going to be the Washington team maybe. They're changing their name finally after all these years, changing their name. But this sort of the kind of editorial cartoon to say, look, why would we do this for Cleveland Indians, but we don't do it for other groups, trying to draw awareness that this isn't something that is an innocent part of history and culture, but there's a lot of meaning and power in representations. This video is a really good one about proud to be a mascot. And it's really about this from Native Americans, the viewpoint in terms of mascots of why sports teams and mascots are problematic. Native Americans are very diverse communities, very, very, very different histories. And this idea of this warrior Indian is a mythology that gets carried forward, and it's very dehumanizing. And it's also distorts the reality in terms of how people live their, historically as well as in contemporary social life. So anyway, really cool, short little video. I think you might find interesting. We'll talk about this handout in class, kind of good handout on signs. Just different examples, thinking about interactionism, gender, the meaning that we assign gender, the language that we kind of engage with in terms of gender today. Something's changed in culture, right? Gender fluidity, cisgender, transgender, different ideas about gender that we're using in more common everyday language, shapes our perspective and how we view the world and describe the world. The meaning that we assign Walmart and Target, right? Like, okay, well, how do we develop sort of perceptions about these things that are beyond the objective idea of what these stores are, but we develop associations, right? I don't know, I found this fun. One day I stumbled across something looking at language from people who are, who are truck drivers. And yeah, they got this language system that's really interesting within their particular industry to describe their particular world, and it wouldn't be one that I knew. So language is a byproduct of group. It's used to describe reality from a group's perspective. It shapes the way that you view the world itself. Language is really powerful. So the idea of things like illegal, undocumented, unauthorized, that language shift is really important. And to understand how language can shape our perceptions at an individual level, but also can shape policy at a much more macro level. Again, I started off the slides with thinking about going to a drugstore, and I saw this sort of, actually, this is a photo that I took. The language describing some of these products for nail polish was really interesting. And there's different, from the lower end nail polish to the more expensive, the language changes. Much more sexualization in the things that cost less than things that cost more. But a lot of gender stuff, I just found it was really fascinating. Then I started going to grocery stores, looking at condoms, and looking at how condoms were being advertised, masculinity. So it's sort of looking sort of an opposite end kind of thing, where you have the ideas of femininity and gender sort of captured in sort of cosmetics. And then I couldn't find, I guess I could get into hand cream for males. But anyway, I started looking at just sort of the idea about masculinity caught up in terms of advertising for contraceptives. Okay, and then we'll kind of talk about this, maybe like thinking about functionalism, application to education. We'll talk about this in the class, but you can kind of start to see that, that from a functionalist viewpoint, making sure that our educational system is operating well, it's functional, it's doing what we ask it to do, because that's not only beneficial to the individual, but it helps create a stronger kind of social world. That's both in terms of things like science, technology, engineering, and math, in terms of gearing up for the new professions or occupations that help us become competitive at a global level, but also things like learning civics. I think, a functionalist would argue that we need to have more civics taught in our schools to create a more collective, cohesive social order. We need to have a better understanding of what civic responsibility means to decrease the divisiveness that we get within our nation. Conflict theory, look at education, different lens, right? And here we're looking at the development of private schools and charter schools comes out in large part, or big influence had to do with desegregation of schools in the 1950s. A lot of white families in the South, as well as the North, said, I'm not going to send my kids to, white families said, I'm not going to send my kids to a school where there's Black kids going to school. So the development of private schools, charter schools, go back, there was a major advance of those schools during that particular time period. And there's still problems and challenges with charter schools today. I mean, there's the degree of segregation, de facto, not by law, but just de facto, it just happens by kind of an order. It goes on. Our charter schools tend to be more racially segregated than public schools. And then you kind of look at this chart here, just looking at how where a person's family they come from has a big influence in terms of what schools they go to in terms of college. So think about the institutional advantages that may go along with that. And, conflict theory is going to be looking at inequalities in order to promote a more equal, equitable social world, right? And that's kind of the viewpoint. And the last one is looking at interactionist viewpoint. I put this here about, we think about community college. I went to community college for a year and then transferred to University of Kansas. It's just interesting, people's perceptions of community colleges. My education at a community college was much stronger. I would argue that community colleges provide a much more, can provide much more rigorous preparation for advanced studies. When I went to University of Kansas, a couple of my undergraduate classes in mass lecture halls, there was no connection to the instructor. It was not a very valuable from an educational viewpoint, very valuable. A lot more mileage gained and from a community college class. I mean, universities offer great classes too, but this idea that people's perceptions, as well as the meaning they assign to different universities, private versus public. What do they think about that? Think about community colleges. There's a lot of status stuff that gets into there. It's just like, where does that come from? You know, it's like, well, shouldn't be about the quality of the education and what you're getting out of that. But there's a lot of status stuff that comes into that piece. So you can think about the different theories. You could apply them to different things. I mean, our job here is apply these theories to a lot of the social world, right? We can take that sociological imagination, that the importance of understanding, policies that are for people who've committed felonies or misdemeanors, looking at our criminal justice system. I mean, you have to understand the history, you have to understand American culture. And the more we understand and more we expose, the more we're empowered to create systems that are more humanizing, that are more beneficial to all of us. But that takes some investigation to make that happen. Functionalist viewpoint on something, looking at the importance of regulation. So criminal justice system is sort of this problem solve, the ways in which we developed criminal justice policies is trying to solve problems within community. If there are problems, they get resolved, kind of thing. Looking at that area of regulation. Conflict theory is looking at, the ways the laws are written, the ways laws are carried out, the way the institution is structured, advantages those with more resources. The laws are written in ways that reinforce class and race interests. So there's all kinds of stuff that are going on there. So it's a little bit about, any system's a little bit about functionalism, a little bit about conflict theory, a little bit about interactionism. But it's really about sometimes what is the case for each theory. So if I'm going to be looking at the criminal justice system, I can look at it from all three viewpoints. And what is the body of evidence and information from each of those particular theoretical viewpoints? So sometimes one theory actually has a better argument, a stronger argument, a better case to be made, but they're coming at things from a different vantage points. All right, so that's it for now. If you have questions, bring them up in class. We'll chat about it. If you can watch those videos, I think you'll enjoy those. Just kind of get a little bit more that are in the PowerPoint. Be safe, be well, have a good rest of your day.